Have you ever wondered what happens when the system turns on one of its own? What happens when a man who has dedicated his life to upholding justice becomes a victim of the very injustice he fights against? The story you are about to hear is not just about a wrongful arrest. It is a story about a quiet showdown, a battle for dignity, and a fateful moment when the man in handcuffs yesterday becomes the man holding the gavel today. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you and what time is it? Drop your answer in the comments below. It's amazing to think that this story is connecting us all from every corner of the globe at every hour of the day. And trust me, stick around until the very end, because the truth of what happened to those two racist cops and the final lesson they were forced to learn will make you rethink everything you know about power and justice. Now, let the story begin. It began on a crisp Tuesday morning, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue, the air carrying the first hints of a Michigan summer. The clock on the dashboard of the black Lincoln Continental read just after 10 a.m. Behind the wheel was Judge Raymond Carter, a black man in his 50s with a calm, commanding presence and hair just beginning to gray at the temples. He was dressed in a slate gray suit and a light blue shirt, looking every bit the part of a man on his way to an important business meeting, which, of course, he was. A slim leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat, neatly containing documents for the governor's roundtable on justice reform, scheduled for noon in Lansing. He'd been on the road for nearly an hour. He decided to pull into a rest area off I-94, about 40 miles west of the city. Not because he was tired, but because he wanted a few quiet moments to review his final notes on his phone to center his thoughts before the crucial discussion. The rest stop was mostly empty. A few large trucks in their designated area, an older couple's RV, and a handful of passenger cars. Raymond parked his Lincoln in the shade of a large oak tree, turning off the engine but leaving the power on. He took a deep breath, soaking in the peace of the moment. Birds chirped. The wind rustled through the leaves. It was a perfect picture of tranquility. For over 20 years on the district court bench, Judge Raymond Carter had forged a reputation across the state. He was known for his calm demeanor, his thorough listening, and his unyielding sense of justice. He'd presided over thousands of cases, from minor civil disputes to complex felony trials. He believed in the law. He believed in the system he had sworn to serve. He believed that dignity and truth were the unshakable pillars of a civilized society. But all of it, the 2 decades of service, the accolades, the respect of his peers, the expensive suit on his back, it all seemed to evaporate in the instant that a white state police patrol car pulled in and stopped directly behind him. The flashing blue and red lights painted the back of his Lincoln, shattering the quiet with a brutal, silent scream. Inside the patrol car, Officer Jeffers narrowed his eyes. Jeffers was a large, white man with a crew cut and a look that was less about observation and more about judgment. From his perspective, a black man sitting alone in a fancy car at a quiet rest stop was cause for suspicion. It didn't fit the pattern in his head. Prejudice, like a toxic fog, had clouded his reason. He didn't see a judge, a model citizen. He saw a profile, a risk profile created from baseless assumptions. He reached for his radio, calling his partner, Officer Reich, who was on patrol just a few minutes behind. Got a situation at the westbound rest stop. Black Lincoln looked suspicious, requesting backup. Not waiting for Wright to arrive, Jeffers opened his car door. The sound of it closing was a dry, hard crack in the peaceful air. Every step he took on the gravel lot was heavy, deliberate, and full of implied authority. He approached the Lincoln, his right hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm, a gesture of both power and threat. Raymond, sensing the officer's approach in his rear-view mirror, let out a quiet, internal sigh. He'd seen this scene before, not for himself, but in his courtroom, in the stories of countless young men who were stopped, searched, and treated like criminals for the color of their skin. He never thought, at his age, in his position, he would be on this side of that story. He calmly lowered his window, placing both hands on the steering wheel in plain sight, a move he knew was necessary to avoid any misunderstanding. "Good morning, officer," he said, his voice perfectly calm and polite. "Is everything all right?" Jeffers didn't answer right away. He looked Raymond up and down with a calculating stare, one that made no effort to hide its suspicion. His eyes swept over the suit, the tie, and settled on Raymond's face. Finally, he spoke, his voice clipped and flat. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description, seen leaving a nearby gas station." It was a lie. There was no such report. It was a pretext, a fabricated reason to justify his groundless suspicion. Raymond blinked, not out of fear, but out of confusion at the absurdity of it. "I'm not aware of any such report, officer," he replied, his tone still mild. "I just stopped here for a few minutes before heading into the city. If you'd like, I can show you my registration." Instead of accepting the offer of cooperation, Jeffers took a step back, his hand now tightening on his weapon. His tone shifted abruptly. The thin veil of professional courtesy vanished, replaced by a raw, authoritative command. "Get out of the car, now!" He barked the words. The air seemed to thicken. The peace was irrevocably broken. For Officer Jeffers, this was an investigation, but for Judge Raymond Carter, this was the beginning of an ordeal he never expected. An ordeal that would test his faith in everything he stood for. Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly. It was a small change on his composed face, but it carried the weight of 2 decades of legal experience. He had heard that shift in an officer's tone before. It was no longer an inquiry. It was now a confrontation. He didn't want trouble, but he also wasn't going to be treated like a roadside criminal. Still, he knew that arguing now would only make things worse. Logic and reason are often the first casualties when prejudice takes command. "Officer, I don't understand the reason I need to exit my vehicle," Raymond said, his voice still even, but now with a new edge of firmness. "You've mentioned a report, but you haven't provided any probable cause. I'm happy to cooperate, but I also have my rights." This response seemed only to add fuel to Jeffers's fire. To him, Raymond's calm and articulate manner wasn't the sign of a law-abiding citizen. It was a challenge to his authority. "I gave you an order," Jeffers snapped, his hand now fully gripping the handle of his gun. "Step out of the vehicle or I'll consider it resisting." Raymond exhaled slowly. He knew he was in a no-win situation. To resist was to invite violence. To comply was to accept this absurd humiliation. He chose the path of less physical risk. He slowly opened the car door and stepped out, his 6-foot frame moving with a placid dignity, betraying no tension or fear. He stood tall, hands by his sides, his eyes locked on the officer. Just then, the second patrol car arrived. Officer Reich stepped out. Reich was younger than Jeffers, with a hint of uncertainty in her movements. She saw Raymond, the well-dressed black man standing opposite her, tense partner. She saw the luxury Lincoln. A flicker of unease went through her. This situation felt wrong, but Jeffers was the senior officer and she was trained to back her partner. "What's going on, Jeff?" Reich asked, her voice hesitant. "Subjects being uncooperative," Jeffers lied, twisting the truth to fit his narrative, "matches the description of a stolen vehicle. I'm going to conduct a search." As Officer Reich arrived, the situation had already escalated. Jeffers had Raymond standing at the rear of the vehicle, hands up, while Reich watched, uncertain but saying nothing. Her internal conflict was palpable. Her gut told her this man didn't look like a car thief. His posture, his clothes, his speech, it all screamed professionalism and decency. But peer pressure and procedure kept her silent. Her silence, in its own way, was a form of complicity. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of," Raymond said, his voice still moderate but with an unshakable firmness. "I've done nothing wrong." Jeffers didn't respond. Instead, he walked around to Raymond's driver's side door, plunged his hand inside the vehicle without permission, and began rummaging through the glove compartment. Raymond's leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat, a silent testament to the life and career these officers were completely ignoring. This action crossed a line. Raymond took a small step forward, a natural reflex to protect his property. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," he stated, his words clear and firm. That was all Jeffers needed. "That's obstruction," he said sharply, as if he'd been waiting for this. "You are interfering with an investigation." Before Raymond could respond, Jeffers grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and snapped a cold metal handcuff onto his wrist. The click of the steel was loud and sharp. Reich hesitated for a second, but when Jeffers nodded at her, she moved in and secured the other wrist. Raymond didn't resist. He stood still, feeling the cold bite of the metal and the cold humiliation of the moment. But instead of rage, a strange calm settled over him. His voice, quiet but even, cut through the space between them. "You are making a very serious mistake." The scene unfolded in front of a few other travelers who had stopped for coffee or to stretch their legs. One of them, a young female college student on spring break, had already taken out her phone and started recording. The small red light of her camera captured everything: Raymond's composure, Jeffers' aggression, Reich's hesitation. Across the parking lot, a retired veteran shook his head slowly and muttered to his wife, "That man doesn't look like he stole anything in his life." Jeffers and Reich didn't seem to notice. They were too focused on escorting Raymond to the back of the patrol car, as if they had just captured a dangerous fugitive. But Raymond walked with dignity, even with his hands cuffed behind him. His head was held high, not in defiance, but in a quiet disbelief that decades of service, honor, and legal expertise could be erased in an instant, reduced to a profile and a guess. Sitting in the back of the police car, separated by a metal cage, Raymond said nothing more. He stared out the window, past the parking lot, past the blurring trees, as if looking for something deeper than the scene unfolding around him. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was calculating, thinking, planning. He knew something these officers didn't. This was not going to end the way they thought it would. The real fight had only just begun. Inside the state police barracks just outside of Jackson, Michigan, Raymond Carter sat quietly on a hard plastic chair. His handcuffs had been removed, but the red welts around his wrists remained, a physical reminder of the indignity he had just endured. The air in the station was thick with the smell of stale coffee, paperwork, and a faint hint of disinfectant. The clatter of keyboards, the squawk of radios, and low conversations formed the mundane hum of bureaucracy. The desk sergeant had checked his ID, but apparently without looking too closely. She had simply typed the information into the system as if it were another routine entry. To them, Raymond was just another middle-aged black man brought in under suspicion. His name, Raymond L. Carter, meant nothing to them. The title judge was unspoken. He didn't yell, he didn't argue. That, in their eyes, made him even more suspicious. People who stayed quiet, who didn't get angry, were sometimes seen as hiding something. The officers didn't recognize his composure as discipline. They mistook it for guilt. Officer Jeffers walked past the waiting area more than once, each time glancing at Raymond with thinly veiled annoyance. He was expecting submission, a plea, or a rageful outburst. Raymond's calm frustrated him. Officer Reich was more subdued, staying mostly in the background, looking uncomfortable at times, but saying nothing. She knew they had crossed a line, but she didn't know how to walk it back. Raymond was detained for nearly 2 hours. No phone call, no explanation, just waiting. He had asked 3 times in a respectful, clear tone to contact his office, explaining that he had an important appointment in Lansing. Each request was either ignored or brushed aside with a, "Wait here." Around him, other officers moved in and out of rooms, casting passing glances at Raymond, but never truly engaging. A few even smirked. He wasn't dressed like someone off the streets. They noticed the polished shoes, the tailored trousers, the posture, but that only made him more of a curiosity. Someone even muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "He thinks he's special." He heard it, but he didn't flinch. He was used to silent judgments. Finally, Jeffers stepped back into the waiting area and leaned against the wall, his arms crossed in a posture of self-satisfaction. "So," he began, his tone mocking, "you're going to tell us why you were just sitting out there with the engine running, scoping out the area, waiting for someone?" Raymond looked up, his eyes meeting Jeffers's with a steady calm. His voice was quiet. "I was reviewing my notes on my phone. I have a meeting in Lansing, that's all." Jeffers scoffed. "You people always have a story." Reich, standing behind him, shifted her weight slightly, a small tell of her discomfort, but said nothing. She knew Raymond's story sounded plausible, far more plausible than Jeffers's car thief theory. Raymond didn't reply. He knew the pattern. They were waiting for him to get angry, to give them a reason to escalate. But he wasn't going to give it to them. He had spent too many years on the bench listening to stories just like this one, from young people who never had the chance to be heard. He wasn't going to feed the cycle. After some time, the watch commander, Sergeant Pamela Yates, came in. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled into a neat bun and sharp eyes that missed little. She had been a cop long enough to know the difference between a real criminal and a situation gone wrong. She stopped when she saw Raymond. Something about this man, the composure, the suit, the way he sat upright in the cheap plastic chair, gave her pause. "How long has he been here?" she asked, directing the question to the room in general. "Almost 2 hours," someone answered from a nearby desk. "Obstruction and a vehicle match." Sergeant Yates frowned and walked over to Raymond. "Sir, have you been advised of your rights?" Raymond nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, but I have not been permitted to make a phone call to my office. I've asked several times." She looked at him more closely now. Something in his tone, clear, calm, precise, made her stop. It wasn't the voice of a defiant suspect. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being respected. "What's your name again, sir?" she asked. "Raymond Carter," he said, "and I strongly suggest that someone run that name before this mistake gets any bigger." Jeffers smirked from behind her. "He's been acting all high and mighty since we brought him in." Yates shot him a sharp look. "That's enough, Jeffers." Then she turned back to Raymond. "Let me see what we've got." She walked to the nearest terminal, typing as she went. It would only take a few moments, but Raymond already knew what she would find. For now, he settled back, silent again, waiting for the moment the room would change. It was coming. He could feel it. The truth, like water, always finds its way. And in this case, it was about to cause a flood. May. Sergeant Pamela Yates stared at the computer screen in front of her. At first, she scanned it casually, expecting to see a clean record, maybe a few traffic tickets. But as soon as the name Raymond L. Carter populated in the system, her eyebrows furrowed. A long list of credentials appeared. Not a criminal record, but a string of stunning accomplishments. Honors from the University of Michigan, a law degree from Harvard Law School, judicial appointments, legal certifications, and then it hit her, the line of text that made her heart skip a beat. The Honorable Raymond L. Carter, Presiding Judge, 14th District Court, State of Michigan. Yates's eyes widened slightly. She double-checked the photo in the file. It was a perfect match for the man sitting quietly in her waiting room. She glanced over her shoulder, through the glass, at him, then back at the screen, blinking once as the reality sank in. They hadn't just arrested the wrong man. They had arrested one of the most powerful figures in their own state's justice system. She rose quickly, her boots making soft but sharp taps across the station floor. The atmosphere around her seemed to change. The daily indifference was replaced by a sudden sense of urgency. When she reached the waiting area, Jeffers was still leaning against the wall, arms crossed, looking smug. Reich stood nearby, trying not to meet Raymond's gaze. Yates said nothing at first. She opened the door and stepped inside. Raymond looked up at her, as composed as ever. "You said you had a meeting in Lansing," she began, her voice completely different now, filled with respect and a hint of alarm. "Yes," Raymond replied, "at noon. I was invited to participate in a round-table discussion on justice reform with the governor." Yates took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "And you are?" Judge Raymond Carter, he gave a slight nod. That's correct. There was a pause that stretched for several seconds. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then she spoke, her words clear and earnest. Your Honor, I apologize. This should never have happened. Behind her, Jeffers straightened up. Wait, what do you mean, Your Honor? Yates turned slowly to face him. Her sharp eyes bored into Jeffers. You just arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant, and you denied him his right to contact an attorney. Her voice was low and ice cold. This is a serious problem, Officer Jeffers. Jeffers' confidence shattered. The color drained from his face. He didn't act like a judge. He didn't say, he shouldn't have to. Yates cut him off, her voice sharp. You had his identification. It was your job to verify it. Instead, you escalated for no reason. You let your prejudice guide your actions. She turned to Reich. You too. You helped handcuff a man without just cause. Do either of you have any idea what this means? The silence in the room was heavy. Jeffers opened his mouth, but no words came out. Reich's face was ashen. The unease she had felt earlier had now blossomed into full-blown horror. She knew she had been wrong to stay silent. Yates turned back to Raymond. Sir, I am so sorry. Would you like to contact the governor's office now, or have someone drive you there? Raymond gave a small smile, not of smugness, but of sheer weariness. Yes, I would. Thank you, Sergeant. She nodded and escorted him from the waiting room. Her tone and posture had now completely transformed. The buzz in the police station changed. Officers looked up from their desks, confusion on some faces, embarrassment on others. The man they thought was just another quiet arrest was now moving through the building with a quiet power and his full dignity restored. And as he walked out of the building, phone in hand, with Sergeant Yates walking beside him, everyone left behind understood that this was far from over. It was just beginning. The mistake made by Officers Jeffers and Reich was no longer a personal error. It had become a ticking time bomb, and it was about to explode in the face of the very system they had sworn to protect. By early that evening, the first video had already gone viral. It was a 27-second clip shot by the college student at the rest stop. It showed Judge Raymond Carter being handcuffed by Officer Jeffers while he calmly asked what he had done wrong. The student's voice could be heard in the background, shaky but clear. This is insane. He didn't do anything. The video spread like wildfire, first on TikTok, then to Twitter and Facebook, with the simple but powerful caption, "Man arrested for being black in a suit." Within hours, it had over 500,000 views. By midnight, it had surpassed 2 million. Local news outlets picked up the story before dawn, followed quickly by national media. Screenshots of Raymond's judicial profile appeared alongside still frames from the arrest video. The contrast between his dignified appearance and the rough manner in which he was treated ignited a firestorm of outrage. Hashtags like #JudgeCarter, #JusticeForRaymond, and profiling at rest stops began trending across platforms. Civil rights leaders, attorneys, and politicians began issuing public statements. Some called for the immediate suspension of the officers involved, while others demanded deeper investigations into the department's practices. The governor's office, after confirming Judge Carter's scheduled appearance at the roundtable, released a short but sharp statement. We are reviewing the incident and remain committed to equality and justice across all state agencies. Community organizations planned press conferences. Protesters gathered outside the Jackson County Barracks by late morning, holding signs that read, "Judged before justice and dignity in handcuffs." What shocked people most wasn't just the arrest. It was the quiet composure on Judge Carter's face as it happened. He didn't resist. He didn't yell. He simply looked like a man who had seen this sort of thing too many times before. That quiet resignation struck a national nerve. He had become a symbol not just of a wrongful arrest, but of how deep the problem ran, when even someone at the top of the legal system couldn't escape the sting of racial prejudice. Inside the police station, the mood had shifted dramatically. Officer Jeffers had been called into an emergency review meeting. Reich remained mostly silent, shaken. Sergeant Yates was fielding calls from internal affairs, the media, and legal counsel. She was now cooperating with the state attorney general's office. No one was smirking or joking anymore. A copy of the viral video had been sent to every computer in the building, and many watched it with clenched jaws and a quiet sense of shame. A few younger officers, especially those newer to the force, whispered to one another about whether this might finally be the moment something actually changed. For once, the system was turning its gaze inward, and this time it wasn't going to look away. The incident with Judge Carter had become a mirror, reflecting the cracks and hidden biases deep within its own foundation. The storm had arrived, and it was heading straight for the heart of Michigan law enforcement. The next morning, the rotunda of the state capitol was unusually quiet. Reporters lined the marble corridor outside room 312, where the roundtable on justice reform was set to begin. Cameramen adjusted their tripods while aides whispered updates into their phones. The governor's staff had already arrived, along with members of the state judiciary and policy experts. But all eyes were on the large oak double doors, waiting for the man whose name was on every screen for the past 18 hours, Judge Raymond Carter. At precisely 10 a.m., the doors opened. Raymond walked in, calm and composed, wearing a crisp dark blue suit, the same leather portfolio in hand, and the same quiet dignity he had carried during the arrest. The room fell silent. For a moment, the noise of politics faded into something more human. Everyone stood up, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect did. He gave a short nod and took his seat at the head of the table. The governor, sitting opposite him, leaned forward and said, his voice sincere, "Judge Carter, we are honored to have you here." Raymond replied with a simple, "Thank you, Governor. I believe the timing speaks for itself." Before the policy discussion could begin, Raymond asked to address the room. "Yesterday morning," he began, "on my way to this very meeting, I was stopped, detained, and handcuffed by 2 officers of our own state police. There was no warrant, no probable cause, only a baseless suspicion tied, I believe, not to my conduct, but to my appearance. The video speaks for itself." His voice was quiet, but it carried a gravity that filled the room. "This is not just about me. I am not the first person this has happened to, and if we do not act, I will not be the last." Across the table, several officials nodded silently. A younger assemblywoman wiped away a tear. Raymond continued, "We often talk about trust between the police and the community, but trust cannot exist without accountability. And dignity, especially the dignity of innocent people, cannot be optional." Following his remarks, the agenda changed. What was planned as a technical discussion about training standards and hiring practices became something far more urgent. Video clips were shown, legal experts weighed in, and civil rights leaders were called into the room. And then came the moment that no one expected. An emergency hearing was convened to begin the review of misconduct charges against officers Jeffers and Reich. And in an unprecedented move, given the highly sensitive nature of the case and to ensure maximum objectivity, a special panel was formed. At the recommendation of the Attorney General's office, and with the governor's approval, Judge Raymond Carter himself was appointed to oversee the session as a neutral authority. He hesitated at first, wanting to avoid any perception of personal bias. But after the governor's legal counsel confirmed that no ethical bar existed, as he was the victim of the conduct, not the initiator of a lawsuit, Raymond accepted. He understood this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoring order and accountability. 2 hours later, in a hearing room downstairs, officers Jeffers and Reich walked in. The room was packed with media, state employees, and a few community members who had managed to gain access. Their usual swagger was gone. Jeffers looked pale, his jaw tight. Reich kept her eyes on the floor. And there, sitting at the center of the panel, flanked by two other judges and the state's attorney general, was Judge Raymond Carter. The man they had handcuffed less than 24 hours ago was now the one who would decide the fate of their careers. The irony was brutal and powerful. Raymond tapped the gavel, and the hearing began. "We are not here to relitigate a public embarrassment," he said, opening the session. "We are here to evaluate conduct and determine if the actions taken violated both legal standards and human decency." The room was dead silent. The reckoning had begun.
Perfect.
The hearing proceeded in a somber, almost suffocating atmosphere. The video evidence from the student's phone was played on a large screen, every second of it scrutinized. Then came the body camera footage from Officer Reich, and then from Jeffers. Tellingly, Jeffers' footage had a technical glitch and only began recording after Raymond was already in handcuffs. A coincidence, the panel noted, with deep skepticism. Reich's footage, however, told a clear story. It showed Raymond's calm and cooperative demeanor and the constant, unwarranted escalation from Jeffers. It also showed Reich's own silence and hesitation. Witness reports, including testimony from the veteran and the college student, were read aloud. The timeline was established showing Raymond had been held for nearly 2 hours without just cause and denied his right to a phone call. Every piece of evidence painted an undeniable picture of prejudice-driven abuse of power. When it was Officer Reich's turn to be questioned by the Attorney General, she looked broken. Under pressure, she admitted that she had not properly reviewed Raymond's ID, nor had she run his name in their system before making the arrest. "Why not, Officer Reich?" the Attorney General asked. Reich faltered. "Officer Jeffers, he was the senior officer. I trusted his judgment." "So you acted on faith in your partner, rather than on evidence and procedure?" "Yes, sir," Reich whispered. When it was Jeffers's turn, he tried to defend his actions, claiming he was following procedure and that he felt threatened. "Threatened by what, Officer Jeffers?" Judge Carter asked, his first direct question. His voice was even, devoid of emotion, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "By a man in a suit sitting quietly in his car, or by the fact that he didn't fit your preconceived notion of who should be driving a Lincoln Continental?" Jeffers was speechless. I was just doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve, not to suspect and accuse based on the color of a man's skin," another judge on the panel interjected. When questioned about why he ignored Raymond's request for a phone call, Jeffers stumbled through a garbled answer about departmental discretion, a defense that held no water under legal scrutiny. Raymond remained professional throughout the entire process, but his tone never softened. The authority in his voice made it clear that the days of casual abuse and unchecked power were ending, starting now, starting here. He was not just a victim, he had become the very embodiment of the accountability the system had been lacking. The hearing concluded just after 5:00 p.m. The panel of judges, after hours of evidence, testimony, and legal review, reached a unanimous decision. Officers Jeffers and Reich were found to have acted with gross negligence, violated protocol, and failed to uphold the basic rights of the individual they detained. The decision recommended that both officers be suspended without pay, pending a full investigation by the State Attorney General's office. The official wording was clear. The incident reflected an abuse of authority based on personal prejudice and a dangerous lapse in professional judgment. As Raymond read the final recommendation aloud, the room was silent. Jeffers said not a word. His mouth was a thin, hard line, his eyes fixed on the table. Reich nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth she had known deep down all along. Cameras outside the hearing room captured every second of their exit. Protesters who had waited all day quietly stepped aside as the officers were escorted from the building. There was no cheering, no shouting, just a heavy silence, the kind that lingers after the truth has finally been spoken. Justice on that day had a calm face and an unshakable voice.
"Judge,
At a press conference held later that evening, the governor stood at the podium with Raymond standing quietly beside him. The governor's face was stern, but it also held a new resolve. "Today was not about revenge," the governor said, his voice echoing through the room. "It was about accountability." Judge Carter showed the restraint and professionalism that every public servant should aspire to, but it should never have been necessary. He went on to announce a series of sweeping reforms prompted by this very incident. A mandatory statewide training program focusing on de-escalation, racial bias recognition, and legal rights would be put into law. Furthermore, the governor proposed the formation of an independent oversight committee to investigate future complaints against police in all counties. "This incident," he declared, "must be the last." The press asked Raymond if he wished to comment. He stepped to the podium briefly, his eyes steady on the crowd of cameras. "What happened to me," he said, his tone retaining its characteristic calm, "happens every day to people who don't have a camera watching, who don't have a title behind their name, who don't have anyone to speak for them. This is not just my story. It is a symptom of a deeper wound in our society. But I believe that wounds can heal with enough sunlight, truth, and accountability." His words resonated. Within a week, departments across the state began reviewing past arrests. Community town halls were organized. Legal clinics offered pro bono advice to citizens who believed they had been unlawfully detained. And across social media, the image of Judge Carter standing in the state capitol, not angry, not vengeful, just firm, became a symbol of justice done right. As for Jeffers and Reich, their suspension triggered an internal review, not just of their actions on that day, but of every case they had been involved in for the last 3 years. Discrepancies began to surface, patterns that had gone unchecked for far too long. Judge Carter's case had opened a Pandora's box, and what was inside was forcing the entire system to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Raymond, meanwhile, returned to his courtroom. He never mentioned the incident from the bench, never showed special favor, never changed his tone. But those who entered his courtroom, from lawyers to defendants, now did so with a new awareness. They understood something important. Justice wasn't just a word carved in stone above the courthouse door. It was a standard that Judge Raymond Carter was determined to uphold, even when it meant standing alone against the very people tasked with protecting it. The ripple from one unjust act had started a wave of reform, and it was only just beginning to spread. 3 months later, on a bright spring afternoon, Judge Raymond Carter stood on the wide stone steps outside the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy. The nearby trees were beginning to bloom, and a gentle breeze moved through the row of flags overhead. Before him, a new class of cadets stood in formation. 52 recruits dressed in crisp uniforms, eyes forward, shoulders squared. This was the first graduating class to be trained under the newly implemented standards of bias awareness and accountability. Every cadet had undergone extensive coursework in community engagement, de-escalation strategies, and constitutional rights. The reforms, once seen by some as controversial, had become a cornerstone of modern training, and it had all started with one video, one moment, and one man who chose to stand firm. Raymond had been invited as the guest speaker. Though he had declined several public appearances since the incident, this invitation felt different. This wasn't about cameras or headlines, but about planting seeds where they mattered most. As he stepped up to the podium, the Academy director gave him a respectful nod. Raymond adjusted the microphone and began in his calm, steady voice. 3 months ago, he said, I stood on the other side of a badge. I was treated not as a judge, not even as a man, but as a threat based on nothing more than a glance and a guess. That experience could have made me bitter, but instead it has made me more dedicated, not to punishment, but to purpose. He paused for a moment, letting the words settle over the group. You are not here just to enforce laws, he continued. You are here to protect dignity. That begins with how you see people, every person, not as a risk, not as a statistic, but as someone's father, sister, neighbor, or friend. Your badge is a symbol of trust. Do not ever betray it." The cadets listened intently, their expressions more thoughtful than formal. A few nodded subtly, absorbing the weight of his words. Raymond looked out over them and felt something shift, not just in the air, but in the culture. There was a seriousness in their eyes, not fear, not pride, just a readiness. They were the new generation of law enforcement, and they were being armed not just with guns and cuffs, but with empathy and accountability. After his speech, the cadets filed out, heading toward their families waiting just beyond the training grounds. One young black recruit paused and turned back. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. Raymond nodded slightly. "Go and serve with honor." As the crowd thinned and the sun began to set, Raymond remained on the steps for a few more minutes. He was no longer thinking about the past, not the handcuffs, not the cold chair in the police station. He was thinking about what came next. Change didn't always come with a loud noise. Sometimes it came slowly, in small moments. One decision, one voice, one classroom, one step at a time. And in that quiet space, Raymond Carter allowed himself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, justice was beginning to rise on a new kind of foundation, one built not on fear, but on fairness. Raymond Carter walked away from the steps of the academy that day, not as a victim, but as a builder of something better. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy. Real reform never is. But he also understood that true change begins in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching. His story became a reminder that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands still, speaks quietly, and waits for the world to catch up. In a country still grappling with deep divisions, Raymond's strength came not from anger, but from purpose. He had turned a traumatic experience into a chance to educate, to reform, and to inspire. In the months that followed, the impact of the rest stop incident continued to ripple outwards. Officer Reich, after her suspension, requested a transfer to a desk job and enrolled in community relations courses, seeking to atone for her failure through action rather than words. She often shared her story with new officers, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience and the need for moral courage. Officer Jeffers, following the full investigation, was dismissed from the state police force. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar complaints in his past, ones that had been overlooked or handled superficially. He faded from public view, a case study in what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. The Independent Oversight Committee was established and began its work, bringing a new level of transparency and accountability to law enforcement in the state. Activists and policymakers from other states began studying the Michigan model as a potential framework for their own reforms. Judge Carter continued his work on the bench. He remained a quiet, composed man, but there was a new authority in his silence. Defense attorneys found that arguments of racial bias were now heard more seriously in his courtroom. Prosecutors became more careful about bringing cases that seemed weak on evidence but strong on racial profiling. He never sought fame, but he couldn't avoid it. He received thousands of letters from across the country, some from people who had endured similar experiences thanking him for giving them a voice, some from police officers expressing shame at their colleagues' actions and pledging to do better, some from young people saying his story had inspired them to pursue careers in law or civil rights. His legacy wasn't written in statutes or headlines. It was written in the small shifts in attitude, in the conversations that took place in patrol cars and locker rooms, in the new awareness that every action could be scrutinized, and that human dignity was not something that could be arbitrarily taken away. It was a quiet legacy, but an immensely powerful one. A year after the incident, an unmarked letter arrived at Judge Carter's chambers. It had no return address. Inside was a single, handwritten page. The script was shaky, but clear. It read, "Judge Carter, I don't know if you'll read this. It's Jeffers. I lost everything. My job, my reputation, the respect of my family. For months I blamed you. I blamed the media. I blamed everyone but myself. I thought you had ruined my life. But the truth is, I had ruined it, long before I ever met you. I had let bitterness and prejudice eat away at me from the inside. I looked at people and didn't see human beings. I saw threats. That day, when I looked at you, I didn't see a judge, a father, a citizen. I just saw the color of your skin and your car, and I made a terrible assumption. I'm not writing this to ask for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. I'm writing to say that, in a strange way, you saved me. Losing everything forced me to look in the mirror and face the person I had become. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be a better man. I'm sorry for everything. Raymond read the letter several times. He felt no sense of victory or triumph. He only felt a deep sadness for a man who had lost his way and for a system that had allowed it to happen. He folded the letter and put it in a drawer. It wasn't a trophy, but a reminder that the fight against injustice isn't just about changing laws, but about changing hearts and minds, even when it's a painful and slow process. The final lesson wasn't about power or revenge. It was about the capacity for change, for redemption, and about the fact that even in the darkest moments, there is a flicker of hope for understanding and humanity. The showdown at the rest stop was over, but the journey toward a truly just society for everyone was still ongoing. We all have a part to play, whether in a courtroom, a classroom, or in our daily choices. Justice begins with how we treat each other, especially when we think no one will notice. Judge Raymond Carter's story is a powerful reminder of that. His strength wasn't in his gavel or his black robe. It was in his unshakable calm in the face of humiliation, his resolve in demanding accountability, and his grace in using his own moment of trial to build a better future for others. He showed us that sometimes the strongest stand is the one taken with quietness, clarity, and courage. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't let it stop here. This is just one of countless stories that need to be told. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss more powerful true stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the quiet heroes among us. Because every subscription is a voice for the truth, and every share is one step closer to a world where dignity is not a privilege but a birthright. Remember that the biggest changes often start with the smallest actions. Thank you for listening. And always ask yourself this question: if there had been no camera, would Judge Carter's story ever have been known?